And we are live. Hi, Sarah.
Hey, Kirby, how are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing fine. The weather's good.
Yes, weather's starting to get more like spring.
Yep.
So, we are today going to talk about the Kouri Richins case. And if you're not familiar with Kouri Richins' case, this is a case that I think actually just culminated last month in March, I think. Sarah, I believe you're not too familiar with this case.
I'm not. Yeah.
Okay, so let me give a little bit of I'm going to show you a video that can give you the full information about the case, and then I'll give a short summary, and we'll talk about why we want to talk about the Kouri Richins case. So, our little video, and let me hit play here.
Appeared on local television to promote a children's book she had written called Are You With Me? The book was about grief, about helping children cope with the loss of a loved one. On camera, Kouri presented herself as a widow and mother of three whose husband, Eric, had died suddenly the year before. But that moment came at a time when investigators were already looking much closer.
All right. So, this is a fairly recent case within the last 4 years that this happened. And I'm just going to give a quick summary of the case, and then we'll go into why we want to talk about it and how to handle it on either law enforcement or not law enforcement point of view. So, a little bit of an overview. Kouri Richins was a Utah real estate investigator and children's author. And you can see that she was, in the video that they kind of mentioned she was a children's author. She was not a children's author prior to the case. So we'll just put that out there. So as she was, working with her real estate, and one of the things she was doing was flipping properties. Some of these properties are multi-million-dollar properties. And so she had to leverage herself in order to purchase the properties in the first place to flip these properties. And so she was taking out loans. And at some point she was overextended on her loans and had to start taking out loans in her husband's name. Or I'm trying to remember if it was loans or just credit card use, whatever. She ended up leveraging some of his credit as well, without his knowledge, from what I understand. Then kind of came to a head where she was either going to she had a chance to close on like a really large deal. And in order to do that, she definitely needed to leverage his, beyond what he was going to allow her to do with his finances. So it seems as though, and watching that court video is going to give you more details, but she tried to kill him on February 14th of that year of 2022, I believe it is, Valentine's Day, by poisoning. But for some reason, he didn't pass away. He actually survived this poisoning. Then he actually was telling his family that he thought she was going to poison him, although it is kind of a jokey almost, it seems as though, maybe to her. I mean, if I thought somebody was seriously poisoning me, I probably wouldn't live with them anymore, right, Sarah?
Right.
I think at that point you might take some steps. So I don't know whether he did get sick on that first poisoning, and was making jokes or maybe not just jokes about it afterwards. However, before the first poisoning, he actually did change some of his like beneficiaries and that sort of thing to his sister, which was kind of interesting. So anyway, and I can't remember exactly what day it was that she eventually did succeed in poisoning him. But at that point, she found out that her sister was actually the trustee for the trust for the children. So all the money, the house, etc., was going through his sister at that point. She was not able to sell the house, which I think was her plan to cover some of her debts. But at that point, she still wasn't under suspicion of murder at that point, because the cause of death at the time was unknown, and she had also spread some rumors that maybe he had been taking some different drugs. They were known to take gummies. The family, the husband and wife, were known to take some THC gummies, but never anything higher as far as the reporting I've seen. But in the end, the cause of death was fentanyl poisoning. And so as soon as that was determined, then she was a suspect. Meanwhile, she's off and her children no longer have a father. And so she writes a book about dealing with grief for children. And she's on a book tour and kind of, all over the place with publicity and this sort of thing, doing interviews, etc., portraying the grieving widow. So they finally arrest her. So then a lot more of course, the details of the case come out after the arrest and, of course, during the trial. But the key thing that I wanted to highlight when we talk about this case is that there's a strong contrast in this case, really, really strong, between the amount of content you can get as a public, any person, either whether you're a journalist or a hobbyist or whatever, and the different kind of information you can get OSINT-wise if you're a law enforcement or on one of the legal teams. All right. So again, the contrast between me as just a member of the public doing an investigation and seeing how much I could get on this case, on this murder case, and how much I could kind of put toward it versus being able to pivot off of some of the non-OSINT content to find more OSINT information. Sarah, does that make sense to you?
Absolutely, it does.
Okay. Okay, so in this case, the prosecution made a case on the financial motive, and again, that would be the different loans, et cetera, possibly even insurance payouts or what she would receive post death of her husband. The relationship dynamics. So not only it wasn't just that she needed money, that there was talk of a divorce earlier in that relationship, as well as she had an affair. At that point, she did have an affair with the person who was helping her do the flipping of the houses. And so there was this one. The prosecution also built some information, some case on digital forensics, on drug-related communications. She did have how she got the fentanyl was originally through one of her employees. And then her post-death behavior, and that is the whole trying to portray herself as formerly successful real estate agent, now successful author, and she's kind of doing this portrayal of success and of wealth that she doesn't have at that point. Mm-hmm. So the timeline, let me give you a little timeline. Pre-2022, there was some marriage strains, finance and control issues, and then her questionable financial activity. Early 2022, we had the alleged failed poisoning attempt and increasing financial pressure. March is when her husband found dead, later confirmed to be fentanyl poisoning. And then post-death, initially suspicious, but there were no charges, and Richins presented as a grieving spouse. Months afterwards, she publishes and promotes her book and reinforces her public narrative. The investigation timeline is that there was the original death in March of 2022. Then the autopsy confirms fentanyl. The investigators also examined the finances, relationship, and the digital activity at that point. 2022 to 2023 is continual evidence gathering. So there was some phone data, the text. Turns out there's some interesting Google searches, some deleted content. There were the communications with the different sources of her drugs. So her source was her employee. Her employee had a source, which was someone who was actually making a living selling drugs out on the streets. And then, of course, his source, we didn't go back that far back. But against financial records. In 2023, she was arrested and the charges were filed. The pre-trial discovery identified some fentanyl-related searches, the messages that indicated planning and the financial motive, and then 2026, the trial and conviction of aggravated murder. Sarah, do you have any input?
Yes, actually. Mm-hmm. So I think whether it's a murder trial or whether it's a bribery trial or a corruption trial, or even if you're an employer or government and you're trying to hire somebody, is knowing if somebody has a high amount of debt is a good thing that you can look up with the open source intelligence. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, if somebody's getting a security clearance, they have to give their financial information. But even if they don't do their financial information, their credit report, is looked up or queried or to see what they have. So I think that's one area that I would look at this and say, that's finances is always a venue that historically has been used to commit crimes.
Right. And something like the credit report might not be able to legally be procured by just anyone, but there's
Right.
other things like property records, liens, and some of the business activities, right?
Oh, totally. Like, I mean, if you're looking at properties in many states in the United States, you can go to the county tax assessor website and see if somebody's behind on their taxes. I mean,
Mhm.
that's an easy one that almost anybody can go and look up, and do. The
Absolutely.
other thing I think about that is very interesting about this case when I was listening to you is, the time between the death and then posting online that she's a successful author. And what was the tone of how she was posting things?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because that can be used for detecting deception.
Right. Yep. Absolutely. So that goes into the public narrative. So public narrative, like her media interviews and her book promotions, the timeline of her storytelling and seeing if that storytelling changes over time. Kind of like looking for shifts and the tone of the shifts. So, for example, when she first goes out and starts promoting her book, she's a grieving widow. She has these grieving children. She's telling the story, and she may tell the story about the death in a different way than months down the road when she knows that she's now a suspect. How does that tone and that story change over time? And of course, it's gonna change even if she's innocent. So you got to remember that this isn't saying that she's guilty, but this is just these little Legos that you're going to try and build a little house with. And our house would be a case against Kouri Richins in this case, right?
Yep.
We also have the social media analysis. So, for example, what is she posting across social media? The grief portrayal, the different inconsistencies across there, and who's she talking to? Who does she talk to, and who does she really communicate with before the death? Who does she really communicate with after the death? Are there any changes there? And I want to highlight that this is something that AI could really help with, both the public narrative and the social media analysis in seeing the differences in time, so that you don't have to, okay, so here she said, this line, this line, this line, this line changes slightly, whatever. The AI could do that much quicker.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do you have anything about the social media you want to mention?
Well, not just the social media, but the messaging apps and the queries that she does online, because that, from a red teaming and blue teaming perspective, is from a red teaming perspective, she was doing queries on fentanyl, and she's doing it on Google where her searches are saved. Then she's leaving a record of an interest in fentanyl for different activities, and we see that time and again in courts in the United States. Is somebody will query something as far as directions before they commit a crime. And the thing that I think that's really fascinating about this at this point is, now that because you mentioned AI, is now artificial intelligence is starting to turn in information to law enforcement and to courts for these kind of queries. So if somebody looked up, instructions on how to make TATAP, and they did it through ChatGPT, then that's going to, put up a red flag in that model that law enforcement could use. So, and I see that.
I want to point out one thing, though, Sarah, is that that's not OSINT, though.
Well, I was about to say that's red teaming and blue teaming. So from a red teaming perspective, that's somebody doing research who's doing it in a way that could get them in trouble. But from a blue teaming perspective, that would fall more into digital forensics.
Right. And so, like, right now, if I want to mention like what OSINT can get, the queries that she's doing on social media, that's digital forensics. That's not something that OSINT comes into at all. However, again, we have two buckets here. We have the people who are outside, and then we have the law enforcement and the legal experts who are on the inside and seeing more evidence. That digital forensics that they see on the inside, then you don't see in court stuff until the trial happens. So that's not something that the outsiders can get. That stuff can inform them on what to look for in OSINT on the other way, what to pivot on. So my big point of this discussion is going to be, what can the outsiders get? Could someone do this investigation and figure it out and provide a case against Kouri Richins without ever having the internal information that law enforcement or legal has?
Theoretically, you partially could by using ad trackers on domains. And I know you're going to think I'm crazy for saying this,
Okay, but hold on. I'll let you
All
say it. I'll let you say it.
okay.
But you need to know ahead of time what
Yeah.
domains to put the ad trackers on. And so we're saying realistically right now, if there was a case going on like this right now, would
Mhm.
somebody on the outside says, okay, I want to do, so for example, there's a case in the Bahamas or in the Caribbean at any rate, where a guy maybe didn't push his wife over into the water, right? Right now, can I see what he's searching? I cannot. I cannot go back in time. I do not know where to put these ad trackers. I don't know where to try and get the queries from. So right now, as an OSINTer, that is not something I get access to.
True.
Yeah.
Unless, yes, true. In general, that is absolutely correct. But, but if somebody wants to weaponize a site and they know that people are going to go to that site and they want to see where they visit online, they can do that legally and collect data from that user just from that one visit to their domain. So somebody goes to a domain and then they go do their research on, poison or ropes or knives or whatever. And the initial website that was used as a honeypot is tracking everywhere they're going and what they're looking up.
That's still not OSINT though. No. That's,
but the collected data from ad tracking, the collected data from ad tracking is legally collected, and some of it is,
but it's not.
And some of it is publicly available. At which point, it's kind of like it's a gray area.
It's publicly available if the collectors also publish.
True. Okay.
So in general, a lot of ad companies aren't. They keep that ad data so they can and I guess it can be considered OSINT because they resell it, but you also need to know where to buy it from and all that stuff. And I'm not just gonna. Okay, there's this guy. I'm gonna guess he's probably looking on Google. Google's not gonna sell it to me. Well, maybe he's looking on this specific website about knives. Well, I need to have access to that specific website. So chances are,
it sounds far-fetched, but I actually have seen ideologically affiliated ad trackers that have been made by entities and put on their websites just for the purpose of tracking where people are going after they go to the website, and that data is going back directly to them and not to an advertising company.
And then they're publishing it. But again, that's not something that could be used in just
everyday stuff. No, that's not going to happen. So, I would say that in this, there was not a lot of stuff that was publicly available, except I would say probably sentiment analysis. Like if you looked at her, public social media posts about her life with her husband. Was it all cheery and happy, or did she complain on Facebook or?
Yeah. So we have that social media aspect of what she was doing before, what she was doing after. We have the financial aspect that we can pull some records from. We have her public appearances and the kind of things that she does there. And then we could put those all together into a timeline and look for changes and patterns and that sort of thing. And so that is some of the stuff that we can do as not involved in the case. We're not law enforcement. We're not part of the legal teams on either side. Those are the things we can get. What we could not get would be the search history, the deleted text, the device data, the messages directly between her and her sources, whether it's the drug sources or personal contacts. We can't get her detailed financial information. We're not going to be able to get her credit report. We can't get the beneficiaries on the insurance records or internal communications with the insurance company. We're not going to be able to get the seized documents, the jailhouse writings, things like that. So there's a lot that we can't get. And all that stuff that I said that we couldn't get provide pivot points for further OSINT searching for the legal teams and for law enforcement and the prosecutors.
And you have law enforcement conducting OSINT investigations after they get those, after they pivot off of that material. But at that point, it's not publicly available OSINT for everybody. So
the pivot point is we wouldn't be able to guess.
Right.
So even though some of the stuff would be OSINT, like they can go and find the person who she's having an affair with because they know through another method, and then they can use OSINT to figure out his network. Well, we wouldn't have been able to just guess that person unless we saw something in her social media or some other kind of web-based connection between them. That's
So
what.
I wanted to add something that I think is interesting though is when I was at Fort Huachuca, it's when you are looking at text posts. That is something that you can do as in OSINT, is look at those text posts and then look at signs or tells for deception with it. But
Okay.
there are manuals, online that you can look at and kind of get an idea of, well, is this a deceptive practice? Is this not a deceptive practice? When I was on the counter disinformation team, one of the things that was always pointed out for some of the disinformation is when they would say, oh, it was a secret source or an unknown source. It could be a secret source, but that's also a very easy way to wrap up deception that there was no source. So there are tells sometimes in text that you can pick up. And so somebody who does OSINT and looks at how to detect deception might be better at picking that up in some of her social media posts.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so here's actually a graduate thesis. Online deception, the impact of language and text-based deception detection. And this one's from the University of Utah. I just did a quick search and pulled this up to see if we could get something quick. And so there is study on that, and that is a possibility. So Sarah, you probably have some better sources for that kind of stuff, but
and you can also AI this. Theoretically, somebody could make their own detecting deception AI agent that they could use for going out and doing research on publicly available social media posts. I don't see why you couldn't.
All right, so I'm searching. I don't know if you can hear my typing. I hope not. Can you hear when I was typing there?
Yeah, but it wasn't obnoxious.
Well, it's not obnoxious to you right now, but it might be some other people. So there's some I might try to mute it when I'm typing. But anyway, I'm going to share this other tab. So here's an example of something on GitHub. Just the multimodal lie detection system using agentic React approach, step-by-step tutorial. So there are people thinking about this. This is, again, something that I just did a quick search on to kind of think, hey, who's building these kind of agents? And sure enough, that we are finding stuff like that.
And I mean, there's still probably a massive hallucination rate with this. And of course, you're also going to have cross-cultural contexts that might not be considered. What might be used in deception in one culture is not going to be used in deception in another. So I do think that, you would definitely have to vet, just like what you would with any AI information,
right.
Human vetted. But I do see that theoretically you could do a level of automation with it.
Right. And the AI can at least give you ideas of where to look. So instead of having the human having to, the AI can say triage, check these and these and these for, here's the type of deception I'm sensing and whatever. And then the human can go and look at it and say, okay, I'm also sensing the deception in that, or not. Using their structured analysis, not just sensing, right? No vibe sensing deception.
So going back to the social media posts that were publicly available that she had, you could do sentiment analysis, you could do detecting, you could do a baseline of detecting deception. And what else could you do with that? Timeline to make sure that the dates that she's saying are congruent to when she said.
Yep.
And then also how much time did she have between grieving and publishing a book?
Well, I mean, and to be honest, that's not an indicator. She could have published it the next day and still not be an indicator. However, I want to point out something. The timeline will be probably shorter than most of her friends would have expected because she did have a ghostwriter. So that's a legitimate thing to have if you have somebody who's helping you get that,
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I do get also that sometimes people will write when they're upset. I got really upset the other day.
I do. Yeah, I definitely write when I'm upset.
And I wrote 20 pages of stuff. So So yeah, but I think you have to balance it and look at everything together holistically.
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, the some of the relevant OSINT techniques we talked about temporal fusion. So it's like creating those timelines from multiple sources. So it's not just a timeline of, like the major events. It can be a timeline. Put in her public speaking. Put in her posts. Put in family posts. Put in whatever the boyfriend posted. Put in all the different paces. Put all that stuff together onto a timeline, because temporal fusion means we want to put see patterns when everything else is happening.
Mm-hmm.
All the context shows up in that, right? There's entity resolution is another OSINT technique that could happen. We identify with people, not only with other people, but with their properties, their businesses, and other legal cases. One of the things I could have looked up to see was somebody suing her beforehand or something like that. Was there some legal cases going on? Like you said before, tax cases. We mentioned the narrative drift analysis. That's tracking changes in messaging over time, and then keeping that in mind that's all the messaging. That's not just tracking changes just in social media, but adding the PR stuff, all the different type of messaging that she's putting out there, and or that anybody else is putting out as well. And then network analysis, all of her relationships, or all of even the murder victims' relationships, and the influences, and who is able to insert some influence on those. That can be useful for identifying, trying to figure out how this happened, but it can also be useful for law enforcement and legal on who to interrogate or interview, and also possibly who can help you with the case in the future by identifying who has the influence.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent summary. Yeah.
Okay. There's also some ethical boundaries that people need to pay attention to, especially when we're talking about OSINT, especially when you're not the legal or law enforcement in charge of this case, right? So appropriate. Public records, the post, the archived media, court docs, stuff you find on the internet. Avoid contacting any witnesses. That is for law enforcement and the legal teams.
Well, and at that point, though, then it's technically not OSINT anyways.
It isn't. No, you can monitor and see what the witnesses say publicly out there, but you should not contact them.
Right. Because investigative journalists, when they interview somebody, at that point, it's not, they're not just using OSINT techniques, they're also using human techniques. So they're combining OSINT with human.
Right. And that's their prerogative if they want to do the human stuff. If they're a journalist, I can see them doing that because they have a duty to the public to inform. But if you're an individual, a hobbyist, you want to test your investigative skills, doing that can mess up the case for the investigators.
Oh, absolutely.
If you're on the other side of things, it can mess up the case for the defense team.
Right. And it could tip somebody off, or if especially like sensitive topics like human trafficking investigations or drug investigations. If you reach out to somebody who's a suspected drug dealer, that totally could tip them off.
Or their family members, if you reach out to their family members. But here's another thing: is even if you reach out to like victims and that sort of stuff, it could mess this up because this is a highly emotionally charged thing for the victims and for the perpetrators. You are going to cause a ripple effect if you reach out to those people. So if you are not a journalist and you're not on the legal team or the prosecution and the investigators, then step back and just monitor what maybe the witnesses say. You think you have somebody who's a witness? What can you find on the internet about it? What did they put in their social media posts? What did they say that they witnessed? And that's your statement for now. You don't get to go any further than that without possibly messing up the case. Additionally, don't go into private accounts. Get what you can get publicly, don't interact with them if possible. Don't share personal data of uninvolved individuals. And so that's, I think, that one of the things that
and that can actually get somebody in trouble depending on what jurisdiction or country they're in, because like in the United States, there's a very low threshold for privacy. So a lot of stuff is fair game that you're able to collect. But if you're sitting in, someplace like under GDPR or the EU, and you pull some of those same things, you could be breaking the law. So it's really important to kind of look and say, is what I'm collecting in the first place legal?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You could be breaking the law, and you could also be ruining somebody's life as well. So I know that there's been some cases where the wrong person is accused of a crime. And even though things might get corrected right away, that person still feels impact.
I had somebody do that to me.
You did? Uh-huh.
I did. I was a sock puppet. I'm not going to say what platform, but I was a sock puppet on a platform. And I was doing a social experiment to get the people on the platform riled up. Long story, don't ask. But in any case, I did it. I got them super riled up. And then they doxed this lady psychologist in Florida and said it was me.
See, and now she's an innocent victim of this whole thing.
Yeah.
They didn't verify. They didn't identify that they had the wrong person. And that's so easy to happen that the thing is that now needs to happen. Mm-hmm.
And I did not impersonate her. So, but somehow they, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I put on do not disturb. So it's just gonna, okay, I quit it. Okay, sorry about that.
Okay. It got past your do not disturb?
Yeah, it got past my do not disturb.
Somebody said yes, disturb anyway.
But no, I mean, I was not impersonating her. I don't know why they came up with their concoction that I was her, but somehow they decided that my fake persona was her and they went after her. And I mean, I even told them, I'm like, I'm not her. Yeah. And they still were going after her. And I'm like, so, yeah. So, and that, by the way, was not an OSINT exercise. That at that point is not an OSINT exercise. If you're ever using a research,
doing other things,
I was doing other things.
Has done in her career, other different non-OSINT things. But
it was other things, and it was done legally and all that kind of stuff. But what the other thing I did want to say is there is a clear line there. So when you're on social media, if you're trying to get stuff off of Facebook and you have a passive research account, that it's a research account, that is totally different than having a sock puppet and talking to somebody. Because once you're talking with them or you're engaging, that's not OSINT, that's not passive investigations. That would fall into investigative journalism or human.
And that's what she was doing at the time. This is not having to do with a case like the Kouri Richins case. This is something that Sarah was working on separately.
It was a social experiment just to see how people would react. And I was being polite and nice, and I wasn't doing anything unethical. And I just want to premise it.
And these weren't suspects on anything.
Right.
Okay. Anyway, okay, moving on from our disclaimers. Okay. So anyway, takeaways that I wanted to highlight for this is that OSINT, from just on the outside, not part of the teams, can identify motive signals, right? It can identify some possible motives. That doesn't mean the person did it, just possible motive. It can reconstruct timelines. You can analyze public narratives. Even without forensic evidence or private data and criminal intent, you can identify and interpret some of the public record, and that can provide information. That alone probably won't solve the case. You do need the law enforcement and law enforcement pivots to it, but it could definitely inform and give you some. I mean, if you're journalist, it gives you stuff to write about for sure. And as just a public individual, you can send those tips into law enforcement if you want. You can say, okay, here's my OSINT analysis that I did not mess with your case. I didn't touch any of that, but here's my analysis. You can send that in if you want, or you can publish it somewhere, again, without interfering.
And to
add one thing, the case.
Yeah, I wanted to add one thing to that is when somebody does have something that they feel that they should give to law enforcement, absolutely they should do it. And if the law enforcement doesn't react to the way they like, because I have seen some vigilantes online that are like, oh, well, this police officer is not using my information, and then starts like saying bad things about the police officer. That person doesn't know what kind of investigation the police are actually doing. So the police actually could be very, very active on it, and they could be conducting covert surveillance. And it's not so
honest. They could take that information. They could be taking that information and say, this is good info, but they can't tell you that yet.
Right. Exactly. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really important is that you should do due diligence and you should turn it in, but don't always expect a response.
And that's something that's hard to swallow sometimes as an analyst. Sometimes you get a lot of great information and you send it in, but there's people on the other end who they can't because of their job duties, they cannot send the information back. They can't even necessarily tell you if your information was good. You sent it into them, they use it, and then someday you might see it in the news that something that you sent in, you say, yes, I knew that was right, you know?
Right.
And that's happened quite a bit for, you know, coming from an intelligence and analyst background. Sometimes I'd see some of the stuff that I worked on in presidential speeches and say, oh, that was our team, you know, but.
Yeah. I mean, you're not always going to get a response saying, oh, that was high value. You know, that
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
I mean, does it happen?
You're lucky if you get a thank you, generally, but
yeah. And so I think it's important to always keep that in mind when you're turning something in and
when you're doing your own investigation.
Yeah, but to go ahead and do it.
Yeah, and I want to highlight that we're going to cover some more kind of cases like this. If you have any that you want us to hit, by all means, let us know. But we are going to kind of break down some of the things that you'll see in either Netflix documentaries or on YouTube or in crime docs, things like that. We are going to kind of break them down and say, okay, here's what they're likely to have gotten. Here's where law enforcement had to step in and finish the case. Before we move on, before we do our slap of the day, I do want to highlight we have a new sponsor. I'm very, very happy to have, because this is a sponsor that I've been working with for a long time, not as a sponsor, but just in general, and that is Osmosis, the Osmosis Association. So I want to say, first of all, thank you to the Osmosis Association for sponsoring us. Upcoming soon, May 31 through June 2 is the Osmosis Con. That's going to be in Bonita Springs, Florida, which is very close to Fort Myer. If you need to go on vacation anyway, you want to learn a little bit of osmosis, some OSINT. This is usually what I would consider the best OSINT networking conference in the world, because you get people from around the world, some really cool vendors come and show their awesome OSINT tools. The community is amazing. The talks are great. Not to like give myself some pats on the shoulder, but I am going to be speaking again with Amber Schroeder. We're going to talk about AI. And I hope I see everybody there. And thanks again to Osmosis for being one of our valued sponsors. Our other sponsors, of course, Paraben Corporation and Forensic OSINT. So please visit our sponsors, give them some joy. Give us a like, thumbs up, wherever you're at. Let us know if you're appreciating our show. And should we do some slap of the week, Sarah?
Let's do some slap of the week.
All right.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Yes, definitely. So here's our slap of the week.